Bravo 7 to command. We are completely overrun. They're coming from all sides. We've lost half our squad. The desperate scream crackled through Lieutenant Jake Morrison's radio before dissolving into static and gunfire. In the suffocating heat of the Kandari Mountains, 32 Rangers of the 2nd Battalion found themselves trapped in a killing field with no way out, ammunition running low, and hope fading faster than the desert sun. What happened next would defy every rule of warfare and leave seasoned soldiers questioning everything they thought they knew about impossible odds. Because sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places, delivered by someone the military brass never saw coming. The coordinates read 34 degrees 42 minutes north, 69 degrees 28 minutes east. But to Staff Sergeant Ryan Walsh, it might as well have been the gates of hell. The abandoned mining complex in the Kandari Valley had been their objective. A simple reconnaissance mission that intel promised would be a routine sweep and clear. That was 6 hours ago, before the ambush, before the reinforcements arrived, before everything went catastrophically wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Command, this is Ranger Actual. Walsh barked into his headset, pressing himself against the crumbling concrete wall of what used to be a processing plant. Bullets whined overhead, chipping away at his cover with methodical precision. We are combat ineffective. Repeat, we are combat ineffective and require immediate extraction. The response was a wash of static punctuated by the distant voice of Colonel Harrison back at Forward Operating Base Phoenix, over 40 kilometers away. Ranger Actual, interference, storm system. Cannot dispatch, hold position. Hold position? Corporal Danny Martinez laughed bitterly from behind an overturned mining cart, blood seeping through a makeshift bandage on his shoulder. With what? We've got maybe 60 rounds between all of us, sir. Walsh did a quick mental count of his remaining men. 32 had entered the valley that morning, full of confidence and military precision. Now, scattered across the industrial wasteland, only 18 were still operational. The rest lay motionless among the rusted machinery or had been dragged to safety by their brothers, their breathing shallow and labored. Private Tommy Chun, no relation to any previous characters, looked up from where he was attempting to treat Specialist Rodriguez's leg wound. Sarge, the bleeding won't stop. He needs a real medic, not field dressing. Real medics back at Phoenix? Walsh muttered, scanning the ridgeline where muzzle flashes erupted like deadly fireworks. The enemy had them surrounded on 3 sides, using the high ground to devastating effect. Classic textbook tactics that were working exactly as intended. The sound of approaching vehicles echoed through the valley, heavy diesels grinding up the mountain road. Walsh's heart sank. More reinforcements for the enemy. Through his binoculars, he could make out at least 3 technical vehicles, each mounted with heavy machine guns, winding their way up the serpentine path. They're bringing up the big guns, observed Sergeant First Class Mike Thompson, the squad's designated marksman, though his M14 rifle seemed pitifully inadequate against what was coming their way. How long until air support? Martinez called out, ducking as another burst of automatic fire shredded the metal above his head. Walsh checked his watch. Earliest estimate was 40 minutes. That was 20 minutes ago. So 20 more minutes, Thompson said, ejecting an empty magazine and slapping in his last full one. I've got maybe 30 rounds left. 15, Martinez reported. 8, came the voice of Corporal Jenkins from somewhere behind a stack of concrete pipes. The math was simple and devastating. 8 men reporting ammunition counts that wouldn't last 5 minutes in a sustained firefight, with enemy reinforcements arriving momentarily, and 20 minutes until possible air support that might not even come due to the storm system moving in from the north. The first technical crested the rise, its .50 caliber machine gun swiveling toward their position like the eye of some mechanical death god. The gunner behind it was clearly visible, grinning as he prepared to unleash hell on the trapped Americans below. "This is it, boys," Walsh said into his headset, his voice carrying the resigned calm of a professional soldier who had accepted his fate. "It's been an honor serving with." The crack of a high-velocity rifle cut through his farewell speech like a thunderclap. Through his binoculars, Walsh watched in stunned disbelief as the Technical's gunner simply vanished. Not fell, not ducked, but disappeared entirely from behind his weapon. The heavy machine gun tilted skyward, unmanned. What the hell was that? Martinez whispered, peering cautiously over his cover. Before anyone could answer, a second shot rang out. The driver of the lead Technical slumped forward, and the vehicle careened off the narrow mountain road, tumbling down the rocky slope in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. The radio in Walsh's ear crackled to life with a voice he didn't recognize. Calm, professional, and undeniably female. Ranger Actual, this is Overwatch. I have eyes on your position. Stay low and let me work. 32 Rangers had entered the Kandari Valley that morning as brothers in arms, confident in their training and their brotherhood. Now, with their backs against the wall and death closing in from three sides, they were about to discover that sometimes the difference between living and dying comes down to one person with the right skills, the right equipment, and absolutely nothing left to lose. The mystery voice on the radio was about to change everything they thought they knew about impossible shots, perfect timing, and what it truly meant to leave no soldier behind. The voice that cut through the chaos of gunfire and dying radios belonged to someone who clearly didn't belong in any official military database. Her tone carried the kind of casual confidence that comes from having done the impossible so many times it becomes routine. Ranger Actual, I need you to mark your furthest advanced position with smoke. Purple if you have it, any color if you don't. Staff Sergeant Walsh pressed himself deeper into his concrete cover, his mind racing. The voice was American, definitely military trained, but there were no friendly snipers supposed to be in this sector. Hell, there weren't supposed to be any friendlies within 50 clicks of their position. Unknown station, identify yourself, Walsh responded, following protocol even as another burst of enemy fire chewed chunks out of his cover. How do you have access to this frequency? A dry chuckle came through his earpiece. Right now, Sergeant, I'm the only thing standing between you and a very bad day. Purple smoke, 30 seconds, or I start making educated guesses about which heat signatures are yours. Corporal Martinez looked across at Walsh, his eyebrows raised in a question. The staff sergeant made a quick decision. Whoever this woman was, she'd already demonstrated she could reach out and touch the enemy at range. In his current situation, mysterious help was better than no help at all. Jenkins, Walsh called out. Pop purple smoke at the pipeline junction. Then get your head down. The smoke grenade hissed to life, sending a violet plume spiraling up into the mountain air. Almost immediately, the woman's voice returned, now carrying a hint of satisfaction. Good copy on the purple. I count 18 thermal signatures in your perimeter. Is that correct? Walsh did a quick head count of his remaining men. That's affirmative. 18 souls. Outstanding. Now listen carefully, because I'm about to give you a masterclass in long-range problem-solving. Through his binoculars, Walsh could see the remaining two technical vehicles had stopped their advance up the mountain road, their crews clearly spooked by the sudden elimination of their lead vehicle. Enemy infantry was taking cover among the rocky outcroppings, but they were still advancing, using fire and movement tactics to close the distance. The crack of the mystery sniper's rifle came again, and Walsh watched through his optics as one of the enemy squad leaders, clearly identifiable by his position and the way other fighters deferred to him, simply crumpled to the ground. The shot had come from somewhere high on the northern ridge, at least 1,500 meters away. Jesus, whispered Private Chun, who had been watching the same target through his carbine scope. That guy just disappeared. 1 second he was giving orders, next second he's down. The psychological effect on the enemy was immediate and devastating. The coordinated advance faltered as fighters looked around nervously, suddenly very aware that somewhere in the rocky wilderness, death was watching them through a high-powered scope. Overwatch, this is Ranger Actual, Walsh said into his headset, his voice carrying a new note of hope. That was beautiful shooting. How many more can you give us? Depends on how many problems you have, Sergeant, came the reply. But I've got a comfortable perch, good visibility, and enough ammunition to ruin a lot of people's day. More importantly, I've got time. The enemy fighters were regrouping now, their initial shock wearing off as their surviving leaders began barking orders in Pashto. They were spreading out, making themselves harder targets, but they were also becoming more cautious, which bought the trapped rangers precious time. Unknown station. Walsh tried again, curiosity getting the better of him. What's your call sign? Who sent you? There was a pause, and when the voice returned, it carried a hint of something that might have been amusement. Call me Phoenix, Sergeant. As for who sent me, let's just say I was in the neighborhood and heard you boys were having some trouble. Corporal Martinez snorted quietly. In the neighborhood? Lady, we're in the middle of nowhere. Phoenix seemed to have heard him, because her next transmission carried a definite note of humor. Corporal, I've been watching this valley for 3 days. You Rangers aren't the only ones interested in what's buried in those old mines. The difference is, when I saw you walking into an ambush, I decided to do something about it. The implications of that statement hit Walsh like a physical blow. This woman, whoever she was, had been conducting her own surveillance operation in the same area where his rangers had been sent on what Intel had called a routine reconnaissance. Either this was the most incredible coincidence in military history, or someone back at headquarters had failed to mention that there were already assets in play. Phoenix, are you saying you were tracking the same targets we were sent to investigate? Sergeant, right now the only thing that matters is getting your people home alive. The war stories can wait until after we've dealt with your immediate problem. As if to punctuate her point, another rifle shot cracked across the valley, and one of the enemy machine gunners who had been setting up a flanking position suddenly pitched backward, his weapon clattering uselessly down the rocky slope. The remaining rangers looked at each other with expressions that mixed relief, confusion, and a growing sense that they were witnessing something extraordinary. In the space of 5 minutes, their hopeless situation had transformed into something resembling a fair fight, all thanks to a mysterious woman with a rifle who seemed to be operating entirely on her own authority. Phoenix, Walsh said, settling more comfortably into his cover as he realized that for the first time in hours, he might actually live to see sunset. I don't know who you are or what you're doing up there, but I owe you a beer when this is over. The response was immediate and carried the kind of professional warmth that comes from one soldier recognizing another. I'll hold you to that, Sergeant. Now keep your heads down. I'm just getting started. 48 hours earlier, Master Sergeant Alexis Phoenix Reeves had been cleaning her custom-built .338 Lapua Magnum rifle in the armory of Camp Thunderbolt, a classified forward operating base nestled in the Hindu Kush Mountains. The weapon was her masterpiece, a precision instrument that she had modified over 3 years of deployment, every component hand-selected and carefully tuned. The carbon fiber stock bore the scars of a dozen missions, and the barrel had been replaced twice after excessive use in the unforgiving mountain environment. The ritual of weapon maintenance was meditation for Phoenix. Each component was disassembled, cleaned, inspected, and reassembled with the kind of methodical precision that separated professional snipers from weekend hunters. The bolt carrier group slid together with a satisfying mechanical click that spoke of perfect tolerances and expert craftsmanship. She had performed this ritual over 300 times, and each time it reminded her why she was still alive when so many others weren't. The armory itself was a monument to organized lethality. Walls lined with weapon racks, ammunition lockers secured with multiple locks, and workbenches equipped with precision tools that cost more than most soldiers made in a year. Phoenix occupied the corner station, her personal workspace that had been unofficially designated as hers after she had consistently outperformed every other sniper in the battalion for 18 consecutive months. Still babying that rifle, Reeves? The voice belonged to Captain Derek Morrison, no relation to the lieutenant trapped in the valley, who commanded the base's intelligence gathering unit. Morrison was new to the mountain warfare theater, having been transferred in from a cushy assignment in Germany 3 weeks earlier. He possessed the kind of confidence that came from theoretical knowledge rather than practical experience. Phoenix didn't look up from her work. She was inspecting the rifle's trigger assembly, a precision mechanism that broke at exactly 2.5 pounds of pressure. Preventive maintenance, sir. This weapon has to perform at ranges where a single grain of sand can mean the difference between mission success and mission failure. Morrison leaned against her workbench, his crisp uniform standing in stark contrast to Phoenix's well-worn fatigues that bore the stains and patches of someone who had spent more time in the field than in air-conditioned offices. "I've been reviewing your mission reports, Reeves. Your success rate is unusual. 97% positive target identification and elimination across 43 separate missions." 98%, sir, Phoenix corrected, sliding the trigger assembly back into the receiver. Mission 44 was completed yesterday. Positive identification and elimination of a high-value target at 1,800 meters in 40-knot crosswinds. Right? Morrison pulled up a tablet and swiped through several screens. "Which brings me to why I'm here. Intelligence has identified a new target area, abandoned mining complex in the Kandari Valley. Satellite imagery shows unusual activity, but we need ground truth before committing significant resources." Phoenix continued working on her rifle, but her attention sharpened. The Kandari Valley was legendary among mountain warfare specialists, a natural fortress where Soviet forces had been decimated in the 1980s, and where more than one American unit had learned harsh lessons about underestimating terrain and enemy capabilities. "What kind of activity, sir?" Morrison scrolled through more data on his tablet. Vehicle movements, communications intercepts, evidence of weapons caching. Could be a staging area for cross-border operations. "We're sending a Ranger reconnaissance element to investigate tomorrow morning." Phoenix finally looked up from her weapon, her pale green eyes meeting Morrison's with an intensity that made him unconsciously step back. She had the kind of gaze that came from having looked through high-powered optics at human targets over impossible distances, the stare of someone who had made life-and-death decisions in fractions of seconds. "Sir, the Kandari Valley is a natural ambush site. 3 ridgelines provide overlapping fields of fire, multiple escape routes for enemy forces, and limited extraction options for our people. If there's significant enemy activity in that area, a reconnaissance element could be walking into a trap." Morrison waved dismissively, the gesture of someone who had never had bullets fired at him in anger. "The Rangers can handle themselves, Reeves. They're the best light infantry in the world. Besides, satellite imagery doesn't show large enemy concentrations. Probably just smugglers or local militia." Phoenix set down her cleaning rod and gave Morrison her full attention. "Captain, with respect, satellite imagery doesn't show fighters hiding in caves or prepared positions. The Kandari Valley has been used as a defensive position for over 200 years. There are tunnels and bunkers in those mountains that predate the Soviet invasion. Are you questioning the mission planning, Sergeant?" Morrison's tone carried a warning edge, the kind of bureaucratic threat that reminded subordinates about the chain of command. "I'm questioning whether the mission planners have adequate intelligence about what they're sending those Rangers into, sir." Morrison closed his tablet with more force than necessary. "The Rangers have their orders, Reeves. Your job is to provide overwatch support if requested. Nothing more. And if they request overwatch support from the Kandari Valley, sir, the nearest supported firing position would be the Northern Ridge Complex, approximately 2,000 meters from the target area. In that terrain, with mountain wind patterns and elevation changes, effective sniper support would require." "Sergeant Reeves," Morrison interrupted, his voice taking on the patronizing tone of someone explaining something to a child. "I appreciate your enthusiasm for your craft, but mission planning is handled by officers who have been trained in operational strategy. Your role is to pull the trigger when told to pull the trigger. Is that understood?" Phoenix looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. In that silence, Morrison caught a glimpse of something that made him profoundly uncomfortable, the cold assessment of a predator evaluating potential prey. It was the look of someone who had killed professional soldiers from distances where they couldn't even see her muzzle flash. "Understood, sir," Phoenix said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "Good." Morrison straightened his uniform and prepared to leave. "The Rangers deploy at 0600 tomorrow. If they need overwatch support, you'll receive mission orders through proper channels." After Morrison left, Phoenix returned to her weapon maintenance, but her mind was elsewhere. She had studied every map, satellite image, and intelligence report about the Kandari Valley that she could access through official channels. What she had found painted a very different picture than the simple reconnaissance mission that Morrison had described. Corporal Jimmy Santos, her spotter for the past 8 months, approached her workstation carrying 2 cups of coffee that could generously be described as toxic waste. "Let me guess," he said, setting down one of the cups. "Captain Morrison thinks he knows better than the woman who has more confirmed kills than the rest of the battalion combined? He thinks the Rangers are walking into a simple sniper overwatch mission," Phoenix replied, accepting the coffee and taking a sip that made her wince. "What he doesn't realize is that they're walking into a killing field, and when the shooting starts, official channels aren't going to be fast enough to save them." Santos studied his partner's face. He had worked with Phoenix long enough to recognize the expression she wore when she was calculating angles, wind speeds, and bullet trajectories. "You're thinking about going off the reservation." Phoenix finished reassembling her rifle and ran the bolt action, the smooth mechanical precision producing a sound like well-oiled steel kissing steel. "I'm thinking about being in the right place when American soldiers need someone to watch their backs." "Phoenix, if Morrison finds out you deployed without orders, then I guess he'll have to court-martial me after I bring those Rangers home alive." Phoenix shouldered her rifle and reached for her gear bag. "Sometimes, Santos, you have to choose between following orders and doing what's right. I've made my choice." She walked toward the exit, her boots echoing in the concrete corridor. Behind her, Santos shook his head and reached for his own gear. He had learned long ago that when Phoenix Reeves made that kind of decision, arguing was pointless. All he could do was make sure she didn't face whatever was coming alone. Outside the armory, the mountain air was crisp and clear, filled with the promise of another day in a war that had no clear end in sight. Phoenix looked up at the stars that would guide her navigation to the Kandari Valley, calculating distances and approach routes. Somewhere out there, Rangers were preparing for a mission that could very well be their last. She intended to make sure it wasn't. 24 hours after Captain Morrison had dismissed her concerns, Phoenix found herself lying prone on the northern ridge of the Kandari Valley, watching through her high-powered spotting scope as 32 Rangers moved through the valley floor like ants walking into a spider's web. The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned mining complex, and every shadow could hide an enemy fighter. She had arrived at her position 6 hours before dawn, using night vision equipment to navigate the treacherous mountain paths that locals had carved into the rock face over generations. Her hide was a natural depression in the granite, reinforced with carefully placed stones and camouflaged with local vegetation. From her position, she had a commanding view of the entire valley and clear lines of sight to potential enemy positions that the Rangers couldn't see from ground level. The intelligence briefing that Captain Morrison had shared with her was criminally inadequate. What satellite imagery had failed to show was the extensive network of fighting positions that had been carved into the mountain faces over decades of warfare. Phoenix could identify at least 15 separate firing positions, each carefully concealed and mutually supporting. The Rangers were walking into a textbook L-shaped ambush, and they had no idea what was waiting for them. Her earpiece crackled with radio chatter from the Ranger frequency as she watched Staff Sergeant Walsh's team move methodically through the mining complex. Professional soldiers doing their job with the kind of precision that made her proud to wear the same uniform, but completely unaware that they were being watched by dozens of hidden eyes. Bravo 7 to Ranger Actual, we're at the primary structure. No signs of recent activity. Phoenix adjusted her spotting scope and focused on the building that Walsh's team was approaching. Through the thermal imaging overlay, she could see heat signatures moving inside the structure, at least 6 fighters who had been waiting in prepared positions. The Rangers were about to walk into a close-quarters kill zone with nowhere to run. She reached for her radio, then hesitated. She had no authority to be on this frequency, no official mission orders, and no legal justification for her presence on the ridge. If she broke radio silence now, she would be revealing her unauthorized deployment to Captain Morrison and potentially facing court-martial proceedings. But if she remained silent, she would be watching American soldiers die when she had the power to prevent it. The decision took her exactly 2 seconds. Phoenix keyed her radio and spoke in the calm, professional tone that had become her trademark during 3 years of combat operations. Ranger Actual, this is Overwatch. You have multiple heat signatures in the primary structure. Recommend you abort approach and establish overwatch position. The response was immediate and carried the kind of suspicious authority that comes from professional soldiers who don't like surprises. Unknown station, identify yourself immediately. You are on a restricted military frequency. Before Phoenix could respond, the ambush began. Muzzle flashes erupted from concealed positions throughout the valley as automatic weapons opened fire on the exposed Rangers. The sound of gunfire echoed off the mountain walls like thunder, and Phoenix watched through her optics as professionally trained soldiers dove for whatever cover they could find in terrain that offered precious little protection. Contact! Contact! We are taking fire from multiple positions. Walsh's voice cut through the chaos, carrying the kind of controlled panic that comes from someone who has suddenly realized that everything has gone catastrophically wrong. Phoenix was already acquiring targets through her rifle scope, her breathing automatically shifting into the rhythm that she had perfected over hundreds of hours of training and dozens of live missions. The .338 Lapua Magnum round was capable of delivering lethal force at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, but effective shooting at that distance required perfect technique and intimate knowledge of environmental conditions. The first target was an enemy machine gunner who had established a position in a natural rock formation overlooking the Rangers' approach route. Phoenix could see him clearly through her optics. A bearded fighter wearing a mixture of military gear and civilian clothing, his PKM machine gun sending sustained bursts of fire into the Rangers' position. The range was 1,800 meters, with a 15-knot crosswind coming from the northwest. She made the necessary adjustments to her scope, accounting for bullet drop, wind drift, and the slight upward angle of her shot. Her breathing slowed to the point where her heart rate became the dominant factor in her body's movement. Between heartbeats, in that moment of perfect stillness that every sniper learns to find, Phoenix squeezed the trigger. The rifle's recoil was substantial but predictable, a sharp shove against her shoulder that she absorbed with practiced ease. Through her scope, she watched the machine gunner suddenly pitch backward, his weapon falling silent as he disappeared behind the rocks that had been his protection. Unknown station, that was our target. Walsh's voice carried amazement and confusion in equal measure. Who is this? How do you have our frequency? Phoenix was already acquiring her second target, a fighter with an RPG who was maneuvering to get a clear shot at the Ranger's position. Ranger actual, explanations later. Right now you have bigger problems. I count at least 30 enemy fighters in prepared positions, and they're trying to cut off your escape routes. She fired again, watching the RPG gunner collapse before he could launch his rocket-propelled grenade. The psychological effect on the enemy was immediate and devastating. Fighters who had been confident in their prepared ambush suddenly found themselves under precision fire from an unknown position. Their coordinated attack began to falter as squad leaders looked around nervously, trying to identify the source of the incoming sniper fire. Captain Morrison's voice suddenly cut through the radio chatter, his tone carrying the kind of bureaucratic outrage that was completely inappropriate for an active firefight. This is command. Unknown sniper, you are operating without authorization in a restricted combat zone. Identify yourself immediately and cease fire. Phoenix ignored him, focusing instead on a cluster of fighters who were attempting to flank the Rangers' position. Her third shot eliminated their squad leader, sending the rest of the group scrambling for better cover and buying the trapped soldiers precious time to reorganize their defense. Ranger actual, this is Overwatch, she said, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that comes from someone who has taken control of a chaotic situation. I can provide precision fire support, but you need to start moving toward better defensive positions. That mining equipment near your 2 o'clock position will give you better cover and cleaner fields of fire. Walsh's response carried gratitude and professional respect. Copy, Overwatch. Moving to mining equipment. Unknown sniper. I don't know who you are, but you just saved our asses. Morrison's voice returned, now carrying a note of recognition that made Phoenix wince. Sergeant Reeves, if that is you on this frequency, you are in direct violation of orders and will face court-martial proceedings. Cease fire immediately and return to base. Phoenix kept her eye pressed to her rifle scope, acquiring new targets as the enemy fighters attempted to reposition. Captain Morrison, with all due respect, Court-martial proceedings are a luxury for people who survive the day. Right now, 32 Rangers are pinned down in a killing field, and I'm the only asset in position to provide effective fire support. She squeezed the trigger again, watching another enemy fighter disappear behind cover as her bullet found its mark. The enemy's coordinated attack was beginning to collapse into individual acts of desperation as fighters realized that their carefully planned ambush had turned into a nightmare of precision fire from an invisible enemy. "Morrison, you pompous desk jockey." Walsh's voice cut through the radio chatter with the kind of blunt honesty that only comes from someone who is facing imminent death. "That unknown sniper just prevented my entire unit from being wiped out. I don't care if she's operating without orders. She's saving American lives." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Phoenix could imagine Morrison's face as he realized that his by-the-book approach to military operations had just been publicly called out by a sergeant who was fighting for his life. Sometimes, she reflected as she acquired her next target, doing the right thing meant ignoring the people who were supposed to be in charge. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since the ambush began, the Rangers had a fighting chance. Phoenix settled more comfortably into her firing position, her rifle warm against her cheek, and prepared to prove that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat comes down to one person willing to ignore orders and do what needs to be done. 3 weeks before Phoenix found herself saving the lives of 32 Rangers, she had been conducting her own unauthorized reconnaissance of the Kandari Valley. What she discovered there should have triggered an immediate intelligence alert and a complete revision of operational planning for the region. Instead, her findings had been buried in bureaucratic channels and dismissed by officers who preferred satellite imagery to boots-on-the-ground intelligence. The warning signs had been accumulating for months like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. Phoenix had noticed them during her previous missions in the region. Subtle changes in enemy movement patterns, increased radio chatter in dialects that suggested foreign fighters, and most tellingly, the appearance of weapons systems that were far more sophisticated than anything local militia groups typically possessed. Her first indication that something significant was developing came during a routine Overwatch mission supporting a convoy along the main supply route. Through her spotting scope, she had observed enemy fighters using coordinated fire and movement techniques that spoke of professional military training. These weren't the typical insurgent tactics of hit-and-run attacks followed by immediate withdrawal. This was methodical, patient, and demonstrated a level of tactical sophistication that set off every alarm bell in her experienced mind. The second warning sign had been the weapons. Phoenix had spent 3 years studying enemy equipment through her rifle scope, and she could identify most small arms at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. What she was seeing now included several weapon systems that shouldn't have been available to local fighters: Chinese-manufactured sniper rifles, Russian-made anti-tank guided missiles, and communication equipment that suggested coordination with external command structures. The third and most disturbing sign had been the terrain preparation. During a solo reconnaissance mission that she had conducted without official authorization, Phoenix had observed extensive defensive preparations in the Kandari Valley that indicated someone was planning for a major engagement. Fighting positions had been carefully camouflaged, fields of fire had been cleared and measured, and supply caches had been established at strategic locations throughout the mountain complex. She had documented everything with digital photography and detailed written reports, creating a comprehensive intelligence package that painted a clear picture of a significant enemy buildup in the region. The Kandari Valley wasn't just another smuggling route or temporary militia hideout. It was being prepared as a major defensive strongpoint that could support sustained operations against American forces. When she submitted her findings through official channels, the response had been swift and predictably bureaucratic. Captain Morrison had called her into his office for a meeting that she still remembered with crystalline clarity. "Sergeant Reeves," Morrison had said, not looking up from the tablet where he was reviewing her report, "this analysis is based on a reconnaissance mission that you conducted without proper authorization. You left your assigned sector without mission orders and gathered intelligence using methods that weren't approved by higher headquarters." Phoenix had stood at attention, her hands clasped behind her back, watching Morrison's reflection in the window behind his desk. "Sir, the intelligence gathered during that mission indicates a significant threat to American operations in this region. The enemy force strength and capabilities are far greater than what's reflected in current threat assessments. The threat assessments are prepared by professional intelligence analysts using multiple sources of information, Morrison had replied, finally looking up from his tablet. Your observations, while enthusiastic, are based on limited visual reconnaissance from a single vantage point. Sir, I spent 18 hours in that valley. I observed enemy positions, counted personnel, and documented weapon systems that indicate. You documented what you thought you saw, Morrison had interrupted. Sergeant, I appreciate your dedication to the mission, but intelligence analysis requires more than one sniper's opinion about what she observed through a rifle scope. Phoenix had felt her jaw tighten, but she had maintained her professional composure. Captain, with respect, I've been conducting reconnaissance and target identification in this region for 3 years. I know the difference between local militia and professionally trained fighters. What's building up in the Kandari Valley represents a significant escalation in enemy capabilities. Morrison had leaned back in his chair, his expression carrying the kind of patronizing patience that superior officers reserved for subordinates who were overstepping their bounds. Reeves, your job is to provide precision fire when directed. Intelligence gathering and threat assessment are handled by people with the appropriate training and clearances. And what happens when those people send a ranger unit into a valley that's been turned into a fortress? The question had hung in the air between them like an accusation. Morrison's expression had hardened, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the unmistakable tone of an order. Sergeant Reeves, you will not conduct any further unauthorized reconnaissance missions. You will not submit intelligence reports based on activities that fall outside your assigned duties, and you will not question operational planning decisions made by your superior officers. Is that understood? Understood, sir. But understanding and compliance were two different things. That evening, Phoenix had returned to her quarters and spread topographic maps of the Kandari Valley across her small desk. Using a red pen, she had marked every enemy position she had observed, noting fields of fire, likely approach routes, and potential ambush sites. The resulting tactical picture looked like a textbook example of how to destroy an unsupported infantry unit in mountainous terrain. She had stared at those maps for hours, knowing that somewhere in the planning cells of higher headquarters, officers were preparing mission orders for operations in the Kandari Valley. Officers who had access to satellite imagery and electronic intelligence, but who had never crawled across 2,000 meters of rocky mountainside to observe enemy positions with their own eyes. The decision to deploy to the ridge overlooking the valley had been surprisingly easy once Phoenix accepted that official channels were not going to adequately protect American soldiers. She had studied the terrain, calculated approach routes, and identified firing positions that would allow her to provide effective overwatch for any unit operating in the valley floor. Her equipment selection had been meticulous. The .338 Lapua Magnum rifle was capable of precision fire at the ranges she would need to cover. Her spotting scope provided magnification and thermal imaging capabilities that would allow her to identify targets in conditions where normal vision would be useless. Most importantly, she had packed enough ammunition to sustain operations for an extended period. The night movement to her position had taken 8 hours of careful navigation through terrain that would have challenged experienced mountain climbers. Phoenix had moved without lights, using night vision equipment and her intimate knowledge of mountain warfare techniques to avoid detection by enemy patrols that she knew were operating in the area. As she had settled into her carefully prepared hide site and watched the sun rise over the Kandari Valley, Phoenix had felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and dread that preceded every mission. She was exactly where she needed to be, with the right equipment and the skills necessary to make a difference. The only question was whether American soldiers would be sent into the valley before intelligence officers realized that their threat assessments were catastrophically wrong. When she saw the Rangers moving across the valley floor that morning, Phoenix had known that her worst fears were being realized. Professional soldiers were walking into a carefully prepared killing field, and the only thing standing between them and annihilation was one unauthorized sniper with a rifle and the determination to do what was right rather than what was officially sanctioned. The warnings had been there for anyone willing to look beyond satellite imagery and intelligence briefs. Unfortunately, The people making operational decisions preferred the comfort of official channels to the inconvenient truths that could only be discovered by getting close enough to smell the enemy's cooking fires and count the magazines in their ammunition pouches. Now, as gunfire echoed across the valley floor and American voices called for help over tactical radio frequencies, those warnings were proving to be prophecy. Phoenix had tried to work within the system, and the system had failed. What happened next would depend entirely on her willingness to ignore orders and trust her own judgment about what American soldiers needed to survive. The moment Staff Sergeant Walsh's voice crackled over the radio with "Contact! Contact! We are taking fire from multiple positions," Phoenix knew that everything she had predicted was coming true in the worst possible way. The Rangers weren't just facing an ambush. They were trapped in a carefully orchestrated killing field that had been months in the planning. From her elevated position on the northern ridge, Phoenix could see the tactical situation with brutal clarity. The enemy hadn't simply stumbled into an engagement with American forces. They had deliberately allowed the Rangers to penetrate deep into the valley, past the point of easy withdrawal before springing their trap. Every escape route had been pre-targeted, every piece of available cover had been ranged and marked, and the timing of the ambush had been calculated to maximize casualties while minimizing the Rangers' ability to fight back effectively. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The communication systems that should have provided the Rangers with immediate support were failing exactly as Phoenix had feared they would. The mountain terrain that made the Kandari Valley such an effective defensive position also created natural dead zones for radio communications. The Rangers' calls for air support and artillery were being absorbed by tons of granite and shale, leaving them isolated and vulnerable at the moment when they needed help most desperately. Captain Morrison's voice cut through the chaos of combat communications with the kind of bureaucratic outrage that was not only inappropriate but actively dangerous. "This is command. All units cease unauthorized communications. Unknown sniper, you will identify yourself immediately and withdraw from the combat zone." Phoenix felt a cold surge of anger that she had to consciously suppress before it affected her shooting. Morrison was more concerned with maintaining his command authority than with saving the lives of soldiers who were dying because his intelligence assessments had been catastrophically wrong. The Rangers were paying the price for his refusal to listen to warnings that could have prevented this disaster. "Ranger Actual, this is Overwatch," Phoenix transmitted, deliberately ignoring Morrison's demands. "I'm reading multiple enemy reinforcement columns moving toward your position. You have approximately 15 minutes before they cut off your remaining withdrawal routes." Through her spotting scope, Phoenix could see vehicles moving along mountain roads that didn't appear on any official maps. Routes that the enemy had prepared specifically for situations like this. Technical vehicles mounted with heavy machine guns, pickup trucks carrying additional fighters, and most ominously, several larger vehicles that appeared to be carrying crew-served weapons that could devastate the Rangers' defensive positions. The tactical mathematics were simple and terrifying. 32 Rangers with limited ammunition and no immediate prospect of reinforcement were facing an enemy force that was growing larger and more capable with each passing minute. The defensive positions available in the mining complex provided some protection, but they were not adequate for a sustained engagement against the kind of firepower that was converging on the valley. Staff Sergeant Walsh's voice came over the radio with the kind of controlled desperation that professional soldiers develop when they realize that their situation has moved beyond bad and into the realm of catastrophic. "Command, we are heavily outnumbered and taking casualties. Request immediate air support and medical evacuation capabilities." The response from Captain Morrison carried none of the urgency that the situation demanded. "Ranger Actual, air assets are not available due to weather conditions. Maintain your position and wait for the tactical situation to develop." Phoenix looked up at the sky, where scattered clouds drifted across an otherwise clear blue expanse. The weather conditions that Morrison claimed were preventing air support existed only in his imagination or in regulations that prioritized risk aversion over the lives of soldiers in contact. She had worked with close air support in much worse conditions, and any pilot worth his wings would have been airborne already if the request had been properly processed. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Morrison wasn't unable to provide air support, He was unwilling to authorize it because doing so would require him to admit that his intelligence assessments had been wrong and that an unauthorized sniper was providing more effective support than his entire command structure. Overwatch to all stations, Phoenix transmitted, making a decision that would probably end her military career but might save American lives. I am assuming tactical control of this engagement. All Rangers maintain your current positions and prepare for coordinated fire support. Morrison's response was immediate and carried the kind of rage that comes from having authority directly challenged in front of subordinates. Sergeant Reeves, you are hereby relieved of duty and ordered to return to base immediately. Any further unauthorized transmissions will result in court-martial proceedings. Phoenix adjusted her rifle scope and acquired a target, an enemy squad leader who was directing fighters into flanking positions that would allow them to attack the Rangers from multiple directions simultaneously. Captain Morrison, with all due respect, court-martial me after I bring these Rangers home alive. The crack of her rifle punctuated her transmission, and she watched through her optics as the enemy squad leader pitched backward, his tactical radio tumbling down the rocky slope. The psychological effect was immediate. Fighters who had been moving with confidence suddenly hesitated, looking around nervously as they realized that death could reach them from distances they couldn't even imagine. Staff Sergeant Walsh's voice came over the radio with a note of grim satisfaction. Unknown sniper, that was beautiful shooting. Keep it coming. But Phoenix could see what the Rangers couldn't. The enemy reinforcements were arriving faster than she could eliminate individual targets. For every fighter she killed, 2 more appeared to take his place. The tactical situation was deteriorating despite her efforts, and she was rapidly approaching the point where precision rifle fire alone would not be sufficient to prevent a massacre. The enemy commanders were adapting to her presence faster than she had hoped they would. Instead of presenting individual targets for her to engage, they were beginning to use covered routes and coordinated movement that made it difficult for her to achieve clear shots. More importantly, they were starting to direct some of their attention toward the ridge complex where she was positioned, recognizing that the precision fire was coming from an elevated position. Phoenix could see muzzle flashes beginning to appear on ridgelines across the valley as enemy fighters with their own long-range weapons began searching for her position. So far, her camouflage and careful positioning were keeping her concealed, but she knew that wouldn't last indefinitely. Once the enemy located her hide site, she would become the primary target instead of the solution to the Rangers' problems. The communications from higher headquarters had taken on the surreal quality of people discussing administrative procedures while soldiers were dying. Morrison's staff was apparently more concerned with identifying who had authorized Phoenix's deployment than with providing the support that could keep 32 Rangers alive. All stations, this is command. Morrison's voice carried the kind of bureaucratic authority that was completely divorced from tactical reality. Any units providing unauthorized support to the engagement in Grid Square 1847 will face disciplinary action. This is a direct order from the commanding officer. Phoenix looked through her rifle scope at Rangers who were fighting for their lives with ammunition that was running dangerously low and no prospect of reinforcement. Professional soldiers who had followed orders, trusted their leadership, and deployed into a situation that intelligence analysts had assured them was manageable. Now they were paying the price for institutional failures that had nothing to do with their own performance or dedication. The decision to continue providing support despite Morrison's direct orders was not difficult. Phoenix had sworn an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, not to follow the orders of incompetent officers who were more concerned with their own authority than with the lives of the soldiers under their command. Ranger Actual, this is Overwatch, she transmitted, her voice carrying the kind of calm determination that comes from having made a decision that transcends personal consequences. I'm going to keep providing fire support until every one of you is out of that valley. Command can sort out the paperwork later. Staff Sergeant Walsh's response carried gratitude that was worth more than any medal or commendation. Copy, Overwatch. We're with you. Phoenix settled more comfortably into her firing position and began acquiring new targets. The enemy was still growing stronger, the tactical situation was still deteriorating, and her own position was becoming increasingly precarious. But 32 American soldiers were counting on her to keep fighting, and she had never walked away from that kind of responsibility. The point of no return had been crossed. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back to the comfortable world of following orders and trusting that someone else would make the difficult decisions. Phoenix had chosen to put the lives of American soldiers ahead of her own career, and she was prepared to live with the consequences of that choice. The tactical situation in the Kandari Valley was deteriorating with mathematical precision. Phoenix could track the degradation through her spotting scope like watching a complex equation solve itself toward an inevitable and catastrophic conclusion. Each minute that passed brought new enemy reinforcements, depleted the Rangers' ammunition reserves, and reduced their options for survival. Through her thermal imaging system, Phoenix counted at least 47 enemy fighters now positioned throughout the valley complex, with more arriving every few minutes. The original ambush force of approximately 30 fighters had been reinforced by elements that were clearly being directed by someone with professional military training. The coordination was too precise, the positioning too sophisticated for local militia operating without external support. Her own ammunition situation was becoming a critical factor in the tactical equation. Phoenix had deployed to the ridge with 60 rounds of .338 Lapua Magnum ammunition, enough for a typical Overwatch mission, but far from adequate for the kind of sustained engagement that was developing. She had already expended 18 rounds, each one carefully placed to eliminate specific threats or disrupt enemy movements. At her current rate of fire, she would be down to her last magazine within 30 minutes. The enemy's adaptation to her presence was accelerating faster than she had anticipated. Instead of presenting individual targets for her to engage, they were beginning to use smoke grenades and coordinated movement that made target identification significantly more difficult. Worse, they had started directing suppressive fire toward the general area of the northern ridge, forcing her to change positions periodically to avoid being pinpointed. Staff Sergeant Walsh's voice came over the radio with the kind of clinical calm that professional soldiers maintain even when discussing their own impending death. Overwatch, we're down to approximately 40 rounds per man. At current expenditure rate, we'll be Winchester in 15 minutes. Winchester, the military term for being completely out of ammunition. Phoenix did the math in her head and didn't like the results. 40 rounds per Ranger, 18 remaining Rangers, meant approximately 720 rounds total. In a sustained firefight against superior numbers, that ammunition would disappear with terrifying speed. Ranger Actual, can you consolidate your position to reduce your defensive perimeter? Phoenix asked while simultaneously tracking an enemy fighter who was attempting to maneuver closer to the Ranger's position. Negative, Overwatch. We've got wounded who can't be moved, and consolidating would put us in a position where indirect fire could take out the entire unit. Phoenix squeezed her trigger, watching the enemy fighter she had been tracking suddenly stumble and fall. 19 rounds expended. Her precision had to be absolute now. Every shot had to count, and she couldn't afford to miss or waste ammunition on targets that weren't immediate threats to the Ranger's survival. The sound of helicopter rotors echoing off the mountain walls should have been cause for celebration, but Phoenix recognized the acoustic signature immediately. The helicopters approaching the valley weren't American. They were Russian-made Mi-17 transport aircraft, almost certainly carrying additional enemy reinforcements or heavy weapons that would tip the tactical balance beyond any hope of recovery. Ranger Actual, you have inbound rotary wing aircraft from the northeast. Not friendly. Recommend you find hard cover immediately. Phoenix watched through her spotting scope as the lead helicopter flared for landing at a prepared site approximately 800 meters from the Ranger's position. Even from her elevated vantage point, she could see personnel and equipment being rapidly offloaded. The professionalism of the operation confirmed her worst suspicions. This wasn't a hastily organized ambush by local fighters. This was a carefully planned operation designed to capture or eliminate an American military unit. The second helicopter was carrying something that made Phoenix's blood run cold. As the aircraft settled onto its landing zone, she could see crew members offloading what appeared to be a 120mm mortar system. Once that weapon was emplaced and operational, the Rangers' defensive positions would become death traps. Mortar fire could reach behind any cover available in the mining complex, and the enemy would be able to systematically destroy the American positions without exposing their own fighters to return fire. Walsh, they're setting up indirect fire capability. You need to start moving toward better positions now, before that mortar comes online. Overwatch, we can't move the wounded, and any movement exposes us to direct fire from at least 6 different positions. Phoenix was facing the kind of tactical problem that had no good solutions. The Rangers needed to move to avoid being destroyed by mortar fire, but moving would expose them to direct fire that could be equally devastating. The enemy had created a situation where every option available to the American forces carried unacceptable risks. The crack of incoming sniper fire struck the rocks near Phoenix's position, sending fragments of granite spinning through the air inches from her head. The enemy had finally located her general position and was beginning to direct precision fire toward the northern ridge. Phoenix rolled sideways into a secondary position she had prepared earlier, but she knew that her time on the ridge was now limited. Captain Morrison's voice cut through the tactical radio traffic with another transmission that demonstrated his complete disconnection from reality. All stations, this is command. I am ordering all unauthorized personnel to withdraw from Grid Square 1847 immediately. Any further violations of direct orders will result in charges being filed under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Phoenix ignored Morrison's transmission and focused on the mortar crew that was rapidly assembling their weapon system. The range to target was approximately 1,200 meters, well within the capabilities of her rifle, but the angle was difficult and the enemy had positioned the mortar behind a natural stone barrier that provided significant protection. She had one chance to disrupt the mortar emplacement before it became operational. The crew chief was clearly visible as he directed the positioning of the weapon's baseplate. If she could eliminate him, it would delay the emplacement process and possibly force the crew to expose themselves while reorganizing their operation. Phoenix controlled her breathing and settled into the firing position that had become second nature after 3 years of combat operations. The crosshairs of her rifle scope centered on the enemy crew chief, and she made the minute adjustments necessary to account for wind speed, bullet drop, and the slight downward angle of her shot. 20 rounds expended. The enemy mortar crew scattered as their leader collapsed, but Phoenix could see them already beginning to reorganize. She had bought the Rangers perhaps 10 minutes before the indirect fire capability would be operational, but 10 minutes was not enough time to fundamentally change their tactical situation. The radio crackled with a new voice, someone Phoenix didn't recognize, speaking with the kind of authority that suggested senior command involvement. This is Colonel Patterson, 5th Special Forces Group. All stations on this net provide immediate situation report. Staff Sergeant Walsh responded with military precision despite the chaos surrounding his position. Colonel, this is Ranger Actual. We are 32 personnel, now 18 effective, pinned down in prepared enemy positions with limited ammunition and no available extraction. We have been receiving fire support from an unknown sniper, but the tactical situation continues to deteriorate. Unknown sniper. Identify yourself immediately. Phoenix hesitated for a moment before responding. Colonel Patterson outranked Captain Morrison by several levels, and his involvement suggested that the situation in the Kandari Valley had attracted attention from higher headquarters. Her response could determine whether she would face court-martial proceedings or whether someone with actual tactical experience would finally provide the support that the Rangers needed to survive. Colonel, this is Master Sergeant Reeves, providing unauthorized overwatch from the northern ridge. I have been engaging enemy targets to prevent the destruction of the Ranger element. There was a long pause before Patterson responded, and when he did, his voice carried the kind of professional assessment that comes from someone who understands both tactics and politics. Sergeant Reeves, maintain your current position and continue providing fire support. I am taking operational control of this engagement. Captain Morrison's voice exploded over the radio frequency with the kind of outrage that comes from having authority directly superseded. Colonel, Master Sergeant Reeves is operating without orders and in direct violation of my specific instructions. I demand that she be ordered to withdraw immediately. Patterson's response was delivered with the kind of cold authority that ends arguments before they begin. Captain Morrison, you are relieved of operational control. All further communications from your station will be ignored unless they relate directly to providing support for the engaged unit. Phoenix felt a surge of relief that was almost physical in its intensity. Finally, Someone with the authority and tactical knowledge necessary to properly support the Rangers had taken control of the situation. But even with Colonel Patterson's involvement, the fundamental tactical problems remained unchanged. The Rangers were still outnumbered, still running low on ammunition, and still trapped in a killing field with limited options for extraction. The mortar crew had reorganized faster than Phoenix had hoped, and she could see them beginning to load their first round. In approximately 2 minutes, high explosive shells would begin raining down on the Rangers' positions, and no amount of command authority would be able to stop the mathematics of indirect fire against exposed infantry. 21 rounds expended, 39 remaining. The tactical situation continued to deteriorate, but now Phoenix had the support of someone who understood what was necessary to keep American soldiers alive. The question was whether that support would arrive in time to make a difference. Colonel Patterson's assumption of operational control should have been the turning point that saved 32 Rangers from annihilation, but Phoenix could see through her spotting scope that the tactical mathematics remained brutally unforgiving. Even with competent leadership finally directing the engagement, the enemy's numerical superiority and prepared positions created a situation where conventional military solutions were inadequate. The mortar crew had completed their weapon emplacement and was beginning to adjust their firing data. Phoenix watched through her optics as the crew chief consulted a range card and made elevation adjustments to the mortar tube. The first ranging shot would be fired within minutes, followed by fire for effect that would systematically destroy every defensive position available to the Rangers. Her own situation was becoming increasingly precarious as enemy countersniper teams began directing sustained fire toward the northern ridge. Phoenix had been forced to abandon her primary hide site and was now operating from a secondary position that offered less concealment and more difficult shooting angles. Granite fragments from near-miss impacts had left cuts on her face and hands, and the constant threat of incoming fire was making it impossible to maintain the kind of steady firing position that precision shooting required. Corporal Santos, her spotter who had followed her unauthorized deployment, despite the obvious risks to his own career, pressed himself against the rocks beside her as another burst of enemy sniper fire struck their position. "Phoenix, they've got us bracketed. Next adjustment and they'll have our exact location." Phoenix nodded grimly while tracking the mortar crew through her rifle scope. Santos was right. The enemy countersniper fire was becoming increasingly accurate with each shot. The professional quality of the marksmanship confirmed her assessment that they were facing foreign fighters with advanced training, not local militia with limited capabilities. "Santos, I need you to start identifying extraction routes off this ridge. When that mortar opens up, we're going to have about 30 seconds before they start dropping rounds on our position." Through her earpiece, Phoenix could hear Colonel Patterson attempting to coordinate air support, but the bureaucratic machinery of military aviation was proving inadequate for the rapidly developing situation. Close air support aircraft were being diverted from other missions, flight plans were being filed, and coordination procedures were being followed while American soldiers died waiting for help that might arrive too late. "Ranger Actual, this is Colonel Patterson. Fast movers are inbound. Estimated time to station 15 minutes. 15 minutes. Phoenix looked at her watch and calculated the tactical timeline with the kind of cold precision that 3 years of combat had taught her. The mortar would be operational in approximately 2 minutes. The Rangers had ammunition for perhaps 10 minutes of sustained combat. Enemy reinforcements were continuing to arrive, and her own position was becoming untenable. Staff Sergeant Walsh's response carried the kind of professional stoicism that infantry soldiers develop when facing impossible odds. "Roger, Colonel. We'll be here." But Phoenix could see what Walsh couldn't. The enemy commanders were no longer content to simply eliminate the trapped Rangers. They were positioning their forces for a coordinated assault that would overrun the American positions before air support could arrive. Fresh fighters were moving into assault positions, heavy weapons were being repositioned to provide covering fire, and the entire tactical picture indicated an imminent ground attack. The first mortar round detonated approximately 50 meters from the Rangers' position, a ranging shot that sent up a column of dirt and smoke while the crew made adjustments for their next round. Phoenix knew that military doctrine called for 3 to 5 ranging shots before fire for effect, which gave her perhaps 2 minutes to disrupt the mortar crew before they began systematically destroying the Rangers' defensive positions. She settled into her firing position and acquired the mortar crew chief through her rifle scope. The range was 1,100 meters, with a 15-knot crosswind that was gusting unpredictably due to the mountain terrain. The downward angle of the shot added additional complexity to her ballistic calculations, and the constant threat of incoming countersniper fire made it impossible to take the time necessary for a perfect shot. Phoenix controlled her breathing and squeezed the trigger during the natural pause between heartbeats that every precision shooter learns to find. 22 rounds expended. Through her scope, she watched the enemy crew chief pitch backward as her bullet found its mark, but the rest of the mortar crew immediately began reorganizing their operation. "Good effect on target," Santos reported while scanning for threats through his spotting scope. "But they're already replacing him. These guys are well-trained." The second mortar round impacted closer to the Rangers' position, indicating that the crew was successfully adjusting their fire despite the loss of their section leader. Phoenix could see the assistant gunner taking over the crew chief's responsibilities with the kind of smooth efficiency that spoke of extensive training and combat experience. Enemy sniper fire struck the rocks inches from Phoenix's head, sending granite fragments spinning through the air and forcing her to roll sideways into yet another firing position. The counter-sniper teams were getting closer to her exact location with each shot, and she was running out of covered positions on the ridge that provided adequate fields of fire. "Phoenix, we need to move," Santos whispered urgently. "They've got us dialed in." Before Phoenix could respond, her earpiece crackled with a transmission that changed everything about the tactical situation. The voice belonged to Staff Sergeant Walsh, but it carried a note of desperation that she had never heard from the professional soldier. "All stations, this is Ranger Actual. Rodriguez just went down. Mortar fragment caught him in the chest. He's bleeding bad, and we don't have the medical supplies to treat a chest wound." Phoenix closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. Rodriguez was one of the Rangers she had been trying to protect, and despite her efforts, the enemy's firepower was beginning to take its toll. The young soldier was dying because she hadn't been able to neutralize the mortar crew quickly enough. The tactical radio frequency erupted with multiple transmissions as various command elements attempted to coordinate medical evacuation procedures, but Phoenix could see the futility of their efforts. Medical evacuation helicopters couldn't operate in the current threat environment, and ground-based medical teams couldn't reach the Rangers' position through the enemy-controlled terrain. "Santos, range to the mortar position? 1,100 meters, but Phoenix, the angle is terrible and they've got counter-sniper teams zeroed on our location." Phoenix looked through her rifle scope at the enemy mortar crew, who were preparing to fire their third ranging shot. Once they achieved accurate range and deflection data, they would begin firing for effect, multiple rounds per minute that would systematically destroy every piece of cover available to the Rangers. Colonel Patterson's voice cut through the radio chatter with the kind of command authority that demands immediate attention. "All stations, this is Patterson. Medical evacuation is not feasible under current conditions. Ranger Actual, you need to hold your position until air support arrives." "Roger, Colonel," Walsh responded, but Phoenix could hear the strain in his voice. Professional soldiers were trained to follow orders even when those orders were impossible to execute, but training couldn't stop arterial bleeding or make ammunition appear in empty magazines. The third mortar round impacted within 20 meters of the Rangers' position, close enough that Phoenix could see dust and debris raining down on the defensive positions through her spotting scope. The crew had achieved adequate range and was now making deflection adjustments to bring their fire directly onto the American positions. Phoenix made a decision that violated every principle of sniper employment and personal survival that she had learned during 3 years of combat operations. Instead of maintaining her concealed position and engaging targets of opportunity, she was going to expose herself to accurate enemy fire in order to eliminate the mortar crew before they could complete their mission. "Santos, when I start shooting at the mortar crew, they're going to know exactly where I am. Get ready to move fast." She shifted position to obtain the best possible angle on the mortar crew, knowing that the movement would expose her to the counter-sniper teams that were already searching for her location. Through her rifle scope, Phoenix could see the enemy gunner preparing to load what would probably be their first round for effect. 23 rounds expended, 37 remaining. The mathematics were simple. She had enough ammunition for perhaps 10 more minutes of sustained shooting. The Rangers had enough ammunition for perhaps the same duration, and enemy reinforcements were arriving faster than she could eliminate individual targets. But sometimes mathematics weren't the determining factor in tactical situations. Sometimes the outcome depended on one person's willingness to accept unacceptable risks in order to protect others. Phoenix settled into her firing position and prepared to engage the mortar crew, knowing that doing so would probably reveal her location to every enemy sniper in the valley. The breaking point had arrived, and everything that happened next would depend on her ability to shoot faster and more accurately than professional soldiers who were trying to kill her from positions she couldn't even see. The moment Phoenix exposed herself to engage the mortar crew, the entire character of the engagement transformed from a calculated sniper duel into a desperate race against time and ballistics. She had approximately 15 seconds to eliminate the mortar crew before every countersniper team in the valley would have her exact position and begin directing concentrated fire at her exposed location. Through her rifle scope, Phoenix could see the enemy gunner lifting a high-explosive round toward the mortar tube's muzzle. Once that round was fired for effect, it would be followed by a systematic barrage that would turn the Rangers' defensive positions into a killing field where no cover would provide adequate protection. Rodriguez was already bleeding out from shrapnel wounds, and direct mortar fire would finish what the ranging shots had started. Phoenix controlled her breathing and settled the crosshairs of her scope on the enemy gunner's center mass. The shot was technically challenging, 1,100 meters downhill with gusty crosswinds and the knowledge that missing would mean immediate and devastating return fire from multiple positions. But technical challenges were what she had trained for during 3 years of combat operations. The crack of her rifle was answered almost immediately by the sharp whistle of incoming sniper fire that struck the rocks beside her head. 23 rounds expended. Through her scope, Phoenix watched the enemy gunner collapse, the mortar round tumbling from his hands to detonate harmlessly against the rocky ground 20 meters from the weapon position. "Target down," Santos shouted while scanning for the source of the incoming fire. "But Phoenix, they've got us." Multiple muzzle flashes from the eastern ridge. Phoenix was already moving, rolling sideways toward the next firing position she had identified during her initial reconnaissance of the ridge. Enemy bullets whined overhead and struck the granite where she had been lying seconds earlier, sending up geysers of rock fragments and sparks. The countersniper teams were professional and accurate, but they were shooting at where she had been rather than where she was going. The mortar crew was attempting to reorganize around their fallen gunner, but Phoenix could see through her spotting scope that the detonation of the dropped round had damaged the weapon's baseplate and scattered the prepared ammunition. The crew chief was gesticulating frantically while trying to assess whether the mortar was still operational, buying the Rangers precious minutes before indirect fire could resume. Staff Sergeant Walsh's voice came over the tactical radio with the kind of professional calm that infantry soldiers maintain even when reporting their own impending destruction. "Overwatch, that was beautiful shooting. The mortar's down, but Rodriguez isn't going to make it without immediate medical attention." Phoenix could see the young Ranger through her thermal imaging system, a rapidly cooling heat signature that indicated severe blood loss and the kind of traumatic injuries that required surgical intervention within minutes rather than hours. The mathematics of combat medicine were as unforgiving as the mathematics of ballistics, and Phoenix knew that Rodriguez would die unless something changed dramatically in the next few minutes. Colonel Patterson's voice cut through the radio chatter with an urgency that suggested he understood the tactical timeline as clearly as Phoenix did. "Fast movers are 5 minutes out. All units maintain positions and mark targets with infrared strobes. 5 minutes." Phoenix looked at her watch and calculated the tactical equation with the kind of cold precision that combat had taught her. The Rangers had ammunition for perhaps 3 more minutes of sustained combat. The enemy was organizing for a final assault that would overrun the American positions before air support could arrive. Rodriguez would be dead in less than 2 minutes without immediate medical intervention. The sound of diesel engines echoing through the valley indicated that enemy reinforcements were still arriving. Through her spotting scope, Phoenix could see at least 3 more technical vehicles moving along the mountain roads, each carrying additional fighters and heavy weapons that would tip the tactical balance beyond any hope of recovery. Enemy sniper fire struck her new position with increasing accuracy, forcing Phoenix to abandon any pretense of concealment and focus entirely on rapid target engagement. She could see muzzle flashes from at least 4 different positions on the eastern ridge, indicating that the enemy had deployed a substantial countersniper capability specifically to eliminate her. Santos, I need suppressive fire on the eastern ridge. Use your carbine to make them keep their heads down while I engage the assault force. Santos immediately began firing controlled bursts from his M4 carbine toward the enemy sniper positions, knowing that his 5.56mm rounds couldn't effectively engage targets at that range but hoping to disrupt their aim long enough for Phoenix to continue shooting. Through her rifle scope, Phoenix could see enemy fighters moving into final assault positions along the southern edge of the mining complex. They were using fire and movement tactics that indicated professional military training, bounding from cover to cover while supporting elements provided covering fire. The coordination was too precise for local militia, confirming her assessment that this was a carefully planned operation designed to capture or eliminate an American military unit. Phoenix engaged the lead assault element with rapid precision fire, her rifle bucking against her shoulder as she worked through her remaining ammunition with the kind of mechanical efficiency that 3 years of combat had made automatic. 24 rounds expended. 25. 26. Each shot was placed with surgical precision, but there were simply too many targets for one sniper to engage effectively. The enemy assault force was adapting to her fire faster than she had anticipated. Instead of presenting individual targets, they were using smoke grenades and coordinated movement that made target identification increasingly difficult. Worse, they had begun directing suppressive fire toward the Rangers' positions with the kind of volume that would prevent effective return fire when the final assault began. Ranger Actual, they're massing for assault. Phoenix transmitted while engaging another target through the drifting smoke. You need to consolidate your ammunition and prepare for close-quarters combat. Walsh's response carried the kind of grim acceptance that professional soldiers develop when they realize that their tactical situation has moved beyond difficult and into the realm of hopeless. Roger, Overwatch. We're down to less than 20 rounds per man. When they come, it's going to be brief. Phoenix could see Rodriguez's heat signature continuing to fade on her thermal imaging display, a young soldier dying because the enemy's firepower had overwhelmed her ability to provide adequate protection. The knowledge that she had failed to prevent American casualties was a weight that threatened to interfere with her shooting, but she forced herself to compartmentalize the emotion and focus on the tactical requirements of the moment. 27 rounds expended, 33 remaining. The mathematics were approaching their inevitable conclusion. She would run out of ammunition before the enemy ran out of targets, and the Rangers would be overrun regardless of how accurately she shot. But sometimes tactical situations weren't determined by mathematics alone. Sometimes the outcome depended on one person's willingness to attempt the impossible when the alternative was watching American soldiers die. The sound of jet engines echoed off the mountain walls as the first close air support aircraft approached the valley. Phoenix could see the aircraft's contrail high above the peaks, but she knew that close air support required time to coordinate and execute safely. Time that the Rangers didn't have. Enemy mortar rounds began falling again as a backup crew brought a second mortar into action from a position Phoenix couldn't see. The rounds were impacting with increasing accuracy, walking closer to the Rangers' defensive positions with each shot. High explosive detonations sent up columns of dirt and smoke, while shrapnel whined through the air like deadly insects. Phoenix made a decision that violated every principle of sniper employment and personal survival that she had learned during her military career. Instead of maintaining her position and engaging targets of opportunity until her ammunition was exhausted, she was going to leave her concealed hide site and move to a position where she could provide direct support to the Rangers during the final assault. Santos, we're moving. Follow me and stay low. She began scrambling down the rocky slope toward the valley floor, carrying her rifle and the 33 rounds that represented the difference between hope and catastrophe. Behind her, enemy sniper fire struck the rocks where she had been shooting, but she was already beyond their adjusted firing data and moving toward a confrontation that would be decided by reflexes and determination rather than precision and calculation. The impossible achievement was about to begin. One sniper against an entire enemy assault force, with 33 rounds and the lives of American soldiers hanging in the balance. Phoenix's descent from the ridge into the valley floor transformed her from a distant guardian angel into a frontline combatant operating at point-blank range where every tactical advantage she had possessed was stripped away. The high ground that had provided concealment and extended range was gone. The carefully prepared hide site that had protected her from counter-battery fire was abandoned. Now she was moving through terrain that the enemy had controlled for hours, carrying 33 rounds and the desperate hope that close air support would arrive before mathematics rendered her intervention meaningless. The rocky slope down from the northern ridge was treacherous even under ideal conditions, but Phoenix was descending while carrying 40 pounds of equipment and being pursued by sniper fire that was becoming increasingly accurate as enemy spotters tracked her movement. Santos followed 10 meters behind her, his M4 carbine ready to provide suppressive fire if they encountered enemy patrols during their descent. "Phoenix, this is insane," Santos whispered as they paused behind a boulder while enemy bullets whined overhead. "We're giving up every tactical advantage we had." Phoenix checked her rifle's action and verified that she had a round chambered before responding. "Santos, those Rangers don't have tactical advantages. They have maybe 15 minutes before they're overrun, and air support isn't going to arrive in time to prevent it." The sound of the second mortar crew firing for effect echoed across the valley as high explosive rounds began systematically destroying the Rangers' defensive positions. Phoenix could see the impacts through gaps in the rocks. Columns of dirt and smoke erupting from the mining complex as shrapnel swept across positions where American soldiers were fighting for their lives with ammunition that was nearly exhausted. Staff Sergeant Walsh's voice came over the tactical radio with the kind of professional report that infantry soldiers provide even when describing their own annihilation. "Colonel, we are taking accurate mortar fire. Martinez is down. Thompson is down. We have multiple casualties and our combat ineffective for offensive operations." Colonel Patterson's response carried the frustration of a competent officer who was watching soldiers die because bureaucratic procedures were preventing him from providing timely support. "Ranger Actual, fast movers are 2 minutes out. Maintain your positions and prepare to mark targets." 2 minutes. Phoenix looked at her watch and calculated the tactical timeline with the precision that 3 years of combat had made automatic. The enemy assault force would be in the Rangers' positions within 90 seconds. The remaining ammunition would be expended in less than 2 minutes of sustained combat. Rodriguez was already dead, and Martinez and Thompson were critically wounded. Phoenix reached the valley floor and began moving through terrain that she had studied through her rifle scope for the past several hours. The abandoned mining equipment that had provided concealment for her long-range shooting now served as cover for her advance toward the Rangers' position, but every piece of machinery could also conceal enemy fighters who were moving to outflank the American defenders. The crack of small arms fire was now constant as the enemy assault force began their final push into the mining complex. Phoenix could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions as fighters moved through the industrial ruins using fire and movement tactics that would overwhelm the Rangers' depleted defensive capability within minutes. Santos grabbed her shoulder and pointed toward a cluster of shipping containers approximately 200 meters from the Rangers' position. "Phoenix, movement. At least 6 fighters using the containers for concealment." Phoenix dropped to one knee and acquired the enemy fighters through her rifle scope. At 200 meters, her .338 Lapua Magnum was devastatingly effective, but engaging these targets would reveal her position to every enemy fighter in the complex. She would become the primary target instead of an undetected threat. "Santos, when I start shooting, every bad guy in this valley is going to know where we are. Get ready to move fast and shoot straight." Phoenix settled into a hasty firing position and began engaging the enemy assault force with rapid precision fire. 28 rounds expended. 29. 30. Each shot was delivered with the kind of mechanical efficiency that separated professional soldiers from amateur fighters, and each impact eliminated a specific threat to the Rangers' survival. The psychological effect on the enemy assault force was immediate and devastating. Fighters who had been confident in their numerical superiority suddenly found themselves under precision fire from an unexpected direction. The coordinated attack began to falter as squad leaders looked around nervously, trying to identify the source of the deadly accurate shooting. But Phoenix's intervention came at a terrible cost. Her muzzle flashes had revealed her position to every enemy fighter in the complex, And within seconds, automatic weapons fire began converging on her location from multiple directions. The shipping container that provided her cover began taking hits that sent sparks flying and punched holes through the steel walls. Staff Sergeant Walsh's voice exploded over the tactical radio with a mixture of amazement and desperate gratitude. "Overwatch, is that you on the valley floor? You magnificent crazy bastard. You're drawing their fire away from our positions." Phoenix was already moving, using the industrial machinery as cover while she continued engaging targets of opportunity. The enemy fighters were adapting to her presence, but they were caught between engaging her position and maintaining pressure on the Rangers' defenses. The tactical initiative had shifted, but Phoenix knew that her advantage was temporary. 31 rounds expended, 29 remaining. The mathematics were approaching their conclusion, but Phoenix could see through her scope that the enemy assault was faltering. Fighters were taking cover instead of advancing. Squad leaders were attempting to reorganize their units, and the coordinated push toward the Rangers' position had stalled. The roar of jet engines passing overhead at low altitude announced the arrival of close air support, but Phoenix could see that the tactical situation was too chaotic for immediate airstrikes. Enemy and friendly forces were now intermixed throughout the complex, creating a targeting nightmare for pilots who needed clear separation between combatants to employ their weapons safely. "Fast mover on station," came the voice of the aircraft pilot over the tactical frequency. "Unable to engage due to danger close. Request clear target designation." Phoenix looked around the industrial complex and realized that she was in a unique position to provide the target designation that close air support required. From her position on the valley floor, she could see enemy concentrations that were separated from friendly forces by adequate distances for airstrikes. "Fast mover, this is ground observer. I can designate targets for immediate engagement." Colonel Patterson's voice cut through the radio traffic with the kind of command authority that ended discussions before they began. "Ground observer, you are authorized to designate targets for close air support. All Rangers take cover and stand by for airstrikes." Phoenix aimed her rifle scope at the largest concentration of enemy fighters, approximately 15 combatants who had taken cover behind a row of concrete barriers 300 meters from the Rangers' position. Instead of engaging with rifle fire, she used her laser designator to paint the target with infrared energy that would be visible to the aircraft's targeting systems. "Fast mover, laser on target. Cleared hot." The F-16 Fighting Falcon rolled into its attack dive with the kind of precision that represented decades of training and millions of dollars in technology. Phoenix watched through her scope as the aircraft's 20mm cannon began firing, sending streams of depleted uranium projectiles into the enemy position with devastating effect. The airstrike was devastating but brief. Within 30 seconds, the enemy concentration behind the concrete barriers had been eliminated, but Phoenix could see other fighter positions that were still active throughout the complex. The close air support had tipped the tactical balance, but the engagement was far from over. 32 rounds expended, 28 remaining. Phoenix continued moving through the industrial ruins, using her remaining ammunition to engage specific threats, while coordinating additional airstrikes against enemy positions that were separated from friendly forces. Staff Sergeant Walsh's voice came over the radio with the kind of professional assessment that indicated his unit was no longer facing imminent annihilation. "Overwatch, the pressure's off. We're no longer in immediate danger of being overrun." Phoenix allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before realizing that her own tactical situation was becoming increasingly precarious. Enemy fighters throughout the complex now knew her approximate location, and she was operating in terrain that provided limited concealment and multiple approach routes for hostile forces. The Pyrrhic victory was beginning to take shape. The Rangers would survive, air support was available to complete the destruction of the enemy force, and American soldiers would be going home alive. But Phoenix's unauthorized deployment and violation of direct orders had been witnessed by multiple command levels, and the administrative consequences would be severe. Santos appeared beside her, his uniform torn and his face streaked with dust and cordite residue. "Phoenix, we did it. We actually did it." Phoenix looked around the smoking ruins of the mining complex where the bodies of enemy fighters lay scattered among the machinery that had provided them concealment. The Rangers were alive, the enemy assault had been broken, and close air support was systematically destroying the remaining threats. But as she listened to the radio chatter coordinating medical evacuation and extraction procedures, Phoenix knew that her military career was effectively over. She had saved American lives by violating direct orders, and the institutional machinery of military justice would not forgive that transgression regardless of the tactical success. The victory was complete, but the cost was just beginning to be calculated. The administrative reckoning came with the mechanical precision of military bureaucracy grinding through its predetermined procedures. Phoenix sat in the same sterile briefing room where Captain Morrison had dismissed her intelligence reports 3 weeks earlier, but the power dynamics had shifted in ways that would have been unimaginable before the Kandari Valley engagement. Across the polished steel table sat Colonel Patterson, flanked by a military lawyer whose presence indicated that formal proceedings were imminent. Morrison was notably absent, having been quietly reassigned to a staff position where his preference for regulations over results would be less likely to endanger American lives. The after-action reports spread across the table told a story that was both triumphant and damning. 32 Rangers had deployed into the Kandari Valley on what intelligence assessments had characterized as a routine reconnaissance mission. 18 had returned alive, thanks to the unauthorized intervention of a sniper who had violated direct orders and operated outside the chain of command. Master Sergeant Reeves, Colonel Patterson began, his voice carrying the kind of weary authority that comes from dealing with situations where doing the right thing conflicts with military regulations. Your actions in the Kandari Valley resulted in the preservation of American lives under circumstances where conventional support was inadequate. Phoenix maintained her professional composure, though she could feel the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. She had known since the moment she decided to deploy to the ridge that her military career would not survive the administrative consequences of her choices. However, Patterson continued, opening a file that Phoenix recognized as containing formal charges under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, your actions were also conducted in direct violation of orders from your commanding officer and without proper authorization from higher headquarters. The legal framework was clear and unforgiving. Article 92. Failure to obey order or regulation. Article 86. Absence without leave. Article 134. General article covering conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. Each charge carried potential penalties that would effectively end her military career and could result in confinement. The military lawyer leaned forward, his expression carrying the kind of professional sympathy that indicated he had handled similar cases before. Sergeant Reeves, the Army acknowledges that your actions resulted in positive tactical outcomes. However, the military justice system cannot ignore violations of the chain of command, regardless of their ultimate consequences. Phoenix had expected this moment since she first picked up her rifle and headed for the Kandari Valley. Military institutions were designed to function through adherence to orders and regulations, not through individual initiatives that bypassed established procedures. Her success in saving American lives actually made her transgression more problematic from an institutional perspective, because it suggested that soldiers could achieve better results by ignoring their superiors. Colonel, Phoenix said quietly, I understood the potential consequences when I made my decision. The Rangers were walking into a prepared ambush, and official channels were not going to provide adequate support in time to prevent casualties. Patterson nodded slowly, his expression indicating that he was struggling with the conflict between institutional requirements and tactical reality. Sergeant Reeves, your intelligence assessments were correct. The Kandari Valley was indeed a prepared defensive position with significantly greater enemy strength than our official estimates indicated. The admission hung in the air like an indictment of the intelligence failures that had nearly resulted in the annihilation of an entire Ranger unit. Phoenix's unauthorized reconnaissance had provided more accurate information about enemy capabilities than months of satellite imagery and electronic intelligence gathering. Your tactical decision-making during the engagement was exemplary, Patterson continued. Your fire support prevented the destruction of the Ranger element, and your coordination with close air support was instrumental in breaking the enemy assault. Phoenix could hear the unspoken conclusion in Patterson's words. She had been right about the intelligence, right about the tactical situation, and right about the inadequacy of official support channels. But being right was not a defense against violating military regulations. The file in front of Patterson contained witness statements from every surviving ranger, each one testifying to the effectiveness of her support and the lives saved by her intervention. Staff Sergeant Walsh had submitted a detailed account describing how her precision fire had prevented the Rangers from being overrun during the critical phase of the engagement. But those same witness statements also documented her unauthorized deployment, her violation of direct orders, and her assumption of tactical control without proper authority. The evidence of her success was also the evidence that would be used to prosecute her under military law. "The Army is prepared to offer you the following arrangement," the military lawyer said, opening a separate folder. "You will accept a general discharge under honorable conditions, forfeit any claim to retirement benefits based on your current rank, and agree not to publicly discuss the circumstances of your separation from military service." Phoenix looked at the papers being offered to her and understood their significance. A general discharge would allow her to avoid court-martial proceedings and the possibility of confinement, but it would also mean forfeiting the military career that had defined her life for the past 8 years. In exchange, Patterson added, "The Army will not pursue criminal charges under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and your personnel record will reflect that your separation was due to administrative requirements rather than disciplinary action." The offer was as generous as military bureaucracy would allow. Phoenix would lose her career and her pension, but she would avoid prosecution and maintain the possibility of civilian employment that required security clearances. It was the kind of compromise that institutions used when they needed to maintain discipline while acknowledging that punishment was inappropriate. Phoenix thought about Rodriguez, who had died from shrapnel wounds despite her efforts to protect him, about Martinez and Thompson, who had survived because her fire support had prevented the Rangers from being completely overrun, about the 32 soldiers who had deployed into the valley that morning, and the 18 who had returned home to families who would never know how close they had come to receiving folded flags instead of living husbands and sons. "Colonel," Phoenix said finally, "will the intelligence failures that led to this situation be addressed?" Patterson's expression indicated that he had expected this question. "Captain Morrison has been reassigned to duties where his administrative skills will be more appropriately utilized. Intelligence procedures for future operations in this region have been revised to include ground truth verification of threat assessments." It was bureaucratic language for acknowledging that Morrison's preference for satellite imagery over human intelligence had nearly resulted in a massacre, but it was also the most accountability that military institutions typically provided for command failures. Phoenix picked up the pen that had been placed beside the discharge papers and signed her name with the same mechanical precision she had used to adjust her rifle scope during 3 years of combat operations. With that signature, she was no longer Master Sergeant Phoenix Reeves. She was a civilian who had once been a soldier. "There is one more thing," Patterson said as Phoenix stood to leave. "The Rangers requested that I convey their gratitude for your actions. Staff Sergeant Walsh specifically asked me to tell you that they understand the sacrifice you made." Phoenix nodded and walked toward the door, carrying the knowledge that 18 American soldiers were alive because she had chosen to do what was right rather than what was officially authorized. The military justice system had rendered its verdict, but the only judgment that mattered to her had already been delivered by the men she had saved. Outside the briefing room, the base continued its daily operations with the same mechanical efficiency that had characterized military installations for generations. Soldiers moved between buildings, vehicles started their engines, and the machinery of war continued its relentless pace. Phoenix walked toward the main gate, carrying the personal equipment that represented 8 years of military service. She had no medal to commemorate her actions in the Kandari Valley, no official recognition of the lives she had saved, and no pension to support her transition to civilian life. But she had something more valuable than any of those things. She had the knowledge that when American soldiers needed someone to stand between them and death, she had answered the call. And when the choice came between following orders and saving lives, she had chosen correctly. The gate guards saluted as she passed through the checkpoint for the last time, not knowing they were watching a ghost fade into the civilian world where heroes carry no rank and receive no recognition for doing what others cannot or will not do. Phoenix Reeves had saved 32 Rangers and lost everything the Army could take from her. But some things cannot be taken away, and the knowledge of what she had accomplished would remain with her long after the bureaucratic machinery of military justice had moved on to other cases. She was unsung, unrecognized, and unemployed, and she was at peace with all of it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.